You know those moments when you read something and it just stops you cold? That happened to me 3 days ago, January 14th, 2026, when the World Economic Forum released their Global Risks Report 2026. They talked to more than 1,300 experts, people running companies, governments, think tanks, and asked what keeps them up at night for the next 24 months. The number one answer wasn't climate catastrophe, wasn't cyber war, wasn't even armed conflict between states. It was geo-economic confrontation, straight up. 18% of them said this is the single biggest trigger for a global crisis in 2026. The risk jumped 8 places in the rankings from last year, now sitting at the very top of the short-term list. What do they mean by geo-economic confrontation? It's countries turning everyday economic tools into weapons, tariffs, sanctions, export bans, investment blocks, supply chain choke points, control over critical minerals and tech. Powers like the US, China, the EU are using these not just for policy, but to gain leverage, punish rivals, protect their own industries. The report calls it the age of competition. The old multilateral rules are breaking down, protectionism is surging, and once you start weaponizing trade, it spreads fast and gets hard to stop. Half the experts expect the next 2 years to be turbulent or stormy, and nearly a third are bracing for armed conflict layered on top of this economic fighting. Sadia Zahidi, one of the managing directors at WEF, didn't mince words. We're standing on a precipice, and mixing geo-economic confrontation with high debt, asset bubbles, and slowing growth could shatter businesses and societies. This isn't theory. It's already playing out with new tariff waves, tech restrictions, and supply chain battles that are driving up costs and creating uncertainty everywhere. The scary part? This exact kind of inward turn, building walls around trade when competition gets tough, is what helped bring down one of the greatest empires in history. Back in the 1930s, Britain did the same thing, shifted from championing free trade to protectionism, created a closed imperial bloc, and watched the global economy fracture while their own power slowly slipped away. The echoes are loud right now. If we don't pay attention to what happened then, 2026 could be the year the same mistakes start repeating on a much bigger scale. Let's go back and look at how Britain got there. Go back to the middle of the 19th century, and Britain was living its best life economically. After decades of debate, in 1846, the government finally killed off the Corn Laws, those old tariffs that protected British landowners by keeping foreign grain expensive and food prices high for everyone else. Prime Minister Robert Peel pushed it through even though it split his own party, because the thinking was simple: let trade flow freely, let the cheapest and best goods win, and the whole country gets richer. And for a long time it looked like the perfect call. Britain had already built the world's first industrial powerhouse. Steam engines, cotton mills, ironworks, railways, and nobody could match the volume or quality. With the Royal Navy controlling the oceans, British ships carried goods to every corner of the globe without much fear. Tariffs stayed low or non-existent on most imports and exports, making London the hub of world finance, and the pound the currency everyone trusted for deals. Raw materials poured in from the empire and beyond: cotton from India, wool from Australia, tea from China. And in return, British factories shipped out finished goods that were cheaper and better than almost anything else. By the 1870s, Britain was handling roughly a quarter of all global trade, and the empire covered about a fifth of the world's land surface. Historians still argue whether free trade created the empire or the empire made free trade possible, but either way, it was a virtuous circle. The British middle class grew, cities boomed, and the idea that open markets brought progress became almost gospel. Politicians, economists, and businessmen preached it like a religion. Competition makes everyone better off. Protectionism is backward. Foreign countries might complain about British dominance, but they kept buying because the prices were unbeatable. It wasn't perfect. Workers in some industries suffered from cheap imports, and colonial exploitation was brutal. But from London's perspective, the system was golden. The empire felt invincible, the economy unstoppable, and the world seemed to run on British rules. That confidence lasted decades, right up until the early 20th century, when the rest of the world started catching up. Wars drained the treasury, and a massive economic shock exposed how fragile even the strongest setups can be. Everything changed after the First World War. Britain went into that conflict as the world's banker and industrial leader, but came out in 1918 with a mountain of debt that changed the game forever. They had borrowed billions, mostly from the United States, to pay for guns, ships, food, everything needed to keep fighting. By the end, the national debt was over 200% of GDP, something Britain hadn't seen since the Napoleonic Wars. The pound sterling, which used to be as good as gold, was under constant pressure. During the war years, while Britain was locked in battle, other countries like the US, Germany, and Japan built up their own factories and industries. When peace came, those competitors were ready to challenge British goods head-on. Exports that used to flow so easily started slowing down, and the old comfortable surplus in trade turned into deficits. Unemployment crept up in the industrial heartlands, textiles in Lancashire, coal in Wales, shipbuilding on the Clyde, and people started feeling the squeeze. Then, the 1920s rolled along with a false sense of recovery, but it was built on borrowed money and shaky foundations. The real hammer fell with the Wall Street crash in October 1929. What started on Wall Street spread like wildfire around the world. Global demand collapsed. People stopped buying, factories closed, trade routes went quiet. Between 1929 and 1932, world trade volume dropped by more than 60%. For Britain, this was catastrophic. Exports, which made up a huge chunk of the economy, evaporated as countries everywhere slammed up barriers to protect their own workers. The gold standard, which Britain stuck to stubbornly long after others abandoned it, made British goods even more expensive abroad because the pound stayed artificially strong. Imports kept coming in cheap, undercutting local producers, while exports couldn't compete. Unemployment soared to 22% in some regions. Soup kitchens appeared in cities and protests turned ugly. The Labour government that came in 1929 couldn't handle the pressure and fell apart in 1931. A new national government took over, heavy on conservatives who had long wanted protectionism. They looked at the chaos and said the same thing over and over. Free trade got us into this mess. We can't keep our doors wide open while everyone else builds walls. We need to protect British jobs, shield home industries, and lean on the one market we can control, the empire. The mood had shifted completely. What used to be seen as backward now felt like common sense. Britain was about to make a U-turn that would redefine its place in the world. By the end of 1931, Britain had run out of room to maneuver. The national government that took over after the Labour collapse was dominated by conservatives who had been waiting years for this moment. They weren't hiding their views anymore. Free trade, the policy Britain had championed for nearly a century, was now seen as a luxury the country could no longer afford. The first big move came in February 1932 with the Import Duties Act. For the first time since the repeal of the Corn Laws, Britain imposed a general 10% tariff on almost all imports that weren't from the empire. There were exemptions for certain raw materials, but the message was clear. Foreign goods would pay a price to enter the British market. The government sold it as a temporary measure to balance the budget and protect home industries, but everyone knew it was a fundamental change. Neville Chamberlain, the Chancellor, stood up in Parliament and said the old system had left Britain exposed, vulnerable to dumping and unfair competition while other countries built high walls. The tariff would give British manufacturers breathing room, raise some much-needed revenue, and give the government leverage in future negotiations. But the real strategy went deeper than that. The act included a clause that allowed the government to offer lower or zero duties to empire countries in exchange for reciprocal access. This wasn't just about money. It was about turning the empire into a protected trading bloc when the rest of the world was turning hostile. Supporters called it Empire First, put British jobs and imperial loyalty ahead of abstract free trade ideals. Critics, including some liberals and economists, warned it would spark retaliation, raise prices for ordinary people, and make recovery from the Depression even harder. They pointed out that global trade was already shrinking fast, and adding more barriers would only make things worse. But the mood in the country had shifted. Unemployment was still sky high, factories were idle, and people were desperate for any plan that promised protection. The idea of leaning on the empire, Canada for wheat, Australia for wool, India for cotton, South Africa for gold, felt like common sense. Britain had the colonies and dominions. Why not use them as a safe market when foreigners were closing their doors? The policy passed with a strong majority, and the stage was set for the next step, a big imperial conference to turn these ideas into actual agreements. In July 1932, leaders from across the Commonwealth arrived in Ottawa, Canada, ready to hammer out the details. What came out of that meeting would lock in Britain's protectionist turn for years and set off consequences that are still studied by economists today. By the end of 1931, Britain had run out of room to maneuver. The national government that took over after the Labour collapse was dominated by conservatives who had been waiting years for this moment. They weren't hiding their views anymore. Free trade, the policy Britain had championed for nearly a century, was now seen as a luxury the country could no longer afford. The first big move came in February 1932 with the Import Duties Act. For the first time since the repeal of the Corn Laws, Britain imposed a general 10% tariff on almost all imports that weren't from the empire. There were exemptions for certain raw materials, but the message was clear. Foreign goods would pay a price to enter the British market. The government sold it as a temporary measure to balance the budget and protect home industries, but everyone knew it was a fundamental change. Neville Chamberlain, the Chancellor, stood up in Parliament and said the old system had left Britain exposed, vulnerable to dumping and unfair competition while other countries built high walls. The tariff would give British manufacturers breathing room, raise some much-needed revenue, and give the government leverage in future negotiations. But the real strategy went deeper than that. The act included a clause that allowed the government to offer lower or zero duties to empire countries in exchange for reciprocal access. This wasn't just about money. It was about turning the empire into a protected trading bloc when the rest of the world was turning hostile. Supporters called it Empire First, put British jobs and imperial loyalty ahead of abstract free trade ideals. Critics, including some liberals and economists, warned it would spark retaliation, raise prices for ordinary people, and make recovery from the Depression even harder. They pointed out that global trade was already shrinking fast, and adding more barriers would only make things worse. But the mood in the country had shifted. Unemployment was still sky high, factories were idle, and people were desperate for any plan that promised protection. The idea of leaning on the empire, Canada for wheat, Australia for wool, India for cotton, South Africa for gold, felt like common sense. Britain had the colonies and dominions. Why not use them as a safe market when foreigners were closing their doors? The policy passed with a strong majority, and the stage was set for the next step, a big imperial conference to turn these ideas into actual agreements. In July 1932, leaders from across the Commonwealth arrived in Ottawa, Canada, ready to hammer out the details. What came out of that meeting would lock in Britain's protectionist turn for years and set off consequences that are still studied by economists today. In July 1932, representatives from Britain and the self-governing dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, plus India and the colonies, arrived in Ottawa for what was supposed to be a grand display of imperial unity. The Depression was still raging. Global trade had shrunk dramatically, and Britain had already put its 10% general tariff on foreign goods earlier that year. Now the goal was to make the empire a self-sufficient trading bloc, trade more within the family, less with outsiders. Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald called it a chance to show the world what cooperation could do, but once the doors closed, it turned into one of the most hard-nosed, drawn-out negotiations in Commonwealth history. Each country came with its own shopping list. Canada wanted to protect its growing factories from British-manufactured goods while selling more wheat and timber to the UK. Australia pushed for safeguards on its wool, butter, and fruit, so British imports wouldn't flood their markets. New Zealand focused on dairy, South Africa on gold and minerals. Britain, meanwhile, wanted the dominions to open their doors wider to British cars, textiles, steel, and machinery. Weeks of late-night sessions, threats to walk away, and private shouting matches followed. Canada's Prime Minister, R.B. Bennett, was especially tough. He wanted high duties on British goods to shield local industry. Australia's Joseph Lyons played hardball too. By early August, they finally signed a series of bilateral agreements, collectively known as the Ottawa Agreements. The headline was Imperial Preference. Goods from within the empire would get lower or zero tariffs, while outsiders faced higher barriers. Britain agreed to keep or raise duties on foreign food and raw materials, so empire suppliers got the advantage. Canadian wheat, Australian wool, New Zealand butter all gained big preferences in the British market. In exchange, the Dominions gave British manufactured goods preferential entry, though often with quotas, minimum prices, or other limits to protect their own producers. India and the colonies got less say. India supplied raw materials but faced restrictions when trying to develop its own industries. The British press hailed it as a triumph of imperial solidarity, a way to circle the wagons against a collapsing world economy. For a moment, it felt like the empire had found a way to survive the storm together. But many economists watching from the sidelines were skeptical. They saw protectionism dressed up as family loyalty, and they worried it would only make the global depression last longer by shrinking trade even more. The agreements locked Britain into a new path, and the effects would play out over the next decade in ways that were both helpful and ultimately damaging. Once the Ottawa Agreements were signed in August 1932, Imperial Preference became the new operating system for the British Empire's trade. The rules were crystal clear and brutally hierarchical. Home producers came first, then the empire, and foreigners got whatever was left, if anything. In practice, this meant Britain kept or raised tariffs on food and raw materials coming from outside the empire. Foreign wheat from Argentina or the United States now faced duties of 10% or higher, while Canadian and Australian wheat slipped in duty-free or at minimal rates. The same went for butter from New Zealand, fruit from South Africa, timber from Canada. Empire suppliers got the inside lane, which gave them a huge price advantage in the British market. British consumers paid a bit more for their bread, butter, and fruit, but the system was designed to protect farmers at home and keep money circulating within the family. On manufactured goods, Britain pushed hard for reciprocal preferences. The Dominions agreed to lower duties on British textiles, machinery, cars, steel, and other industrial products. British cars, for example, entered Canada with lower tariffs than American or German ones, and British textiles got priority in Australian shops. But the Dominions weren't pushovers. They negotiated quotas, minimum price guarantees, and sometimes kept residual tariffs to shield their own emerging factories. Canada, in particular, made sure its growing industrial sector wasn't swamped by cheap British imports. Australia did the same with wool and textiles. The colonies, especially India, were stuck in a different role. They supplied cheap raw cotton, jute, and tea to feed British mills, but when Indian industries tried to develop their own textiles or steel, they often ran into higher duties or restrictions to keep the balance in Britain's favor. By the mid-1930s, intra-empire trade had jumped noticeably. Around 40 to 50% of Britain's total trade was now with the Empire, up from about 30% before Ottawa. The Dominions got a lifeline during the worst of the Depression, and some British factories stayed open because of the protected colonial markets. It created this closed-loop economy that felt secure at the time, like the Empire had finally built a fortress against the global storm. But the system had a dark side. Prices went up for ordinary Britons who had to pay more for basic foods, and the whole setup encouraged retaliation from other countries. Global trade stayed depressed because everyone was raising barriers in response. It was protectionism sold as solidarity, and while it bought short-term breathing room, it locked the empire into a shrinking, inward-looking world just when openness might have helped recovery. The cracks were there, even if they weren't obvious yet. For the first few years after Ottawa, imperial preference looked like a smart move. Intra-empire trade did pick up noticeably. By the late 1930s, around 40 to 50% of Britain's total trade was with the empire, a solid jump from the pre-Ottawa levels of about 30%. The Dominions got real benefits. Canadian wheat farmers sold more to Britain without foreign competition undercutting them. Australian wool and New Zealand butter found steady demand, and South African gold flowed more easily. British manufacturers also got a boost. Textiles, machinery, and cars found protected markets in Canada and Australia, keeping some factories open and jobs alive during the worst of the Depression. The system created a kind of insulated bubble where the empire could trade among itself with lower costs and fewer surprises. It felt like solidarity in action. When the rest of the world was slamming doors, the British family kept theirs ajar for each other. But the wins came with serious hidden costs that became clearer over time. Global trade overall stayed depressed because the Ottawa agreements encouraged retaliation. Other countries saw Britain building a high tariff wall around its empire and responded in kind. Higher duties on British goods, more quotas, more subsidies for their own industries. World trade volume, which had already plunged 60% from 1929 to 1932, recovered slowly and never got back to pre-depression levels until after World War II. Economists like Barry Eichengreen and Douglas Irwin have pointed out that protectionism like imperial preference contributed to the prolonged slump by fragmenting markets and reducing overall efficiency. Prices in Britain went up noticeably. Consumers paid more for bread, butter, sugar, and other basics because foreign suppliers were priced out. The average working family felt the pinch, even if farmers and some industrial workers gained. The empire itself wasn't a perfect closed system. The colonies, especially India, got the raw deal, supplying cheap raw materials, while their own development was held back by preferences that favored British manufacturers. Resentment built up in places like India, where nationalists saw the setup as just another layer of exploitation. And the bigger picture was even more troubling. By turning inward, Britain signaled that the old free trade world order was over, which encouraged everyone else to do the same. The multilateral system that had helped global growth before the war was replaced by rival blocs and beggar-thy-neighbor policies. It bought short-term stability for the empire, but at the price of a slower, more divided recovery for the entire world. The fortress looked strong from the inside, but it was built on shrinking ground, and the empire's long-term decline was already quietly underway. The protectionist turn and imperial preference bought Britain some breathing room in the 1930s, but they didn't stop the bigger slide. By the late 1930s, the empire was still standing, but it was no longer the unstoppable force it had been. Intra-empire trade had increased, sure, but the overall global economy recovered slowly, and Britain never regained the industrial lead it once had. The United States had become the world's biggest manufacturer and creditor. The pound sterling was losing its shine as the top currency, and London's role as the financial capital was slipping. The Ottawa system created a kind of artificial stability inside the empire, but it couldn't hide the deeper problems. High debt from 2 world wars, aging factories, outdated management, and growing competition from countries that had modernized while Britain was busy fighting. When World War II broke out in 1939, Britain had to borrow even more, mostly from the United States again, to survive. By 1945, the country was broke. The empire had been drained of resources, the treasury was empty, and the dominions and colonies were starting to demand more independence. India, the jewel in the crown, was pushing hard for freedom, and the British couldn't afford to hold on. The war had accelerated everything. Colonial troops fought for the empire, but came home expecting equality. Nationalist movements gained strength, and the cost of keeping control became impossible. In 1947, India gained independence, kicking off a wave of decolonization that would see most of the empire dissolve over the next 2 decades. Britain had gone from ruling a quarter of the planet to being a middle-sized power in Europe. Economists and historians like Corelli Barnett and David Edgerton have argued that the protectionist policies of the 1930s contributed to this decline by making the empire too inward-looking. Instead of pushing for innovation and competitiveness in open global markets, Britain relied on sheltered colonial outlets, which delayed necessary reforms. The fortress economy looked safe, but it was brittle. When the world changed again after the war, with new trade institutions like GATT, the early WTO, the Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe, and the rise of American and later Asian manufacturing, Britain was left behind. The empire had been a source of power, but also a burden. By trying to protect it with walls, Britain had actually made it more fragile. The slow fade-out wasn't dramatic like a sudden collapse. It was a gradual loss of influence, wealth, and confidence. The country that once dictated the rules of global trade now had to adapt to a world where others set the terms. The lesson from Britain's story is harsh but clear. When competition heats up and you respond by turning inward, building barriers, instead of competing harder, you might survive the short term, but you risk losing the long game. And that's exactly the risk staring at the world in 2026. Fast forward to right now, January 2026, and the parallels are impossible to ignore. The World Economic Forum's report didn't just name geo-economic confrontation as the top risk for no reason. It's happening in real time. The United States is leading the charge with sweeping tariffs that echo Britain's 1932 pivot in scale and intent. We're seeing proposals for 10 to 60% duties on broad categories of imports, with even higher spikes on things like pharmaceuticals and critical tech from rivals. The stated goal is the same as Britain's back then: protect domestic industries, bring jobs home, reduce dependence on foreign suppliers, and use economic tools to gain leverage in great power competition. Sanctions have become a routine weapon. Export controls on chips and AI tech to China, restrictions on investment flows, and pressure on allies to join in. Supply chains are being weaponized, with critical minerals, rare earths, and semiconductors turned into strategic choke points. The language is eerily familiar. America first, strategic autonomy, decoupling. From adversaries, phrases that sound a lot like empire first and home producers first. Just like Britain in the 1930s, the US is responding to rising competition. China's industrial rise, Europe's push for its own tech sovereignty, and choosing to build walls rather than compete purely on open markets. The WEF experts warn this approach risks a cascade: retaliation from trading partners, fragmented global supply chains, higher inflation from import costs, and slower overall growth as trade volumes shrink. Households could see an extra $100 to $1,500 a year in higher prices. Small businesses get squeezed by uncertainty, and emerging markets face currency crises if the dollar strengthens too much from safe haven flows. The multipolar world the report describes, 68% of experts expect it, means rival blocs forming, just like the Imperial Preference system created a closed empire loop while the rest of the globe raised barriers. Britain thought protectionism would shield it from the Depression storm. Instead, it contributed to a deeper, longer slump and weakened its global position over time. America is now in a similar spot. Powerful, but facing debt burdens, domestic divisions, and competitors who aren't backing down. The difference is scale. This time the fallout would be truly global because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency and American consumption drives so much demand. If tariffs escalate, if sanctions multiply, if supply chains fracture further, 2026 could mark the beginning of a slow unraveling similar to Britain's, where short-term protection comes at the cost of long-term influence and prosperity. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the patterns rhyme too loudly to dismiss. The question is whether the lessons from the 1930s are being ignored, or if they're being deliberately followed. So here we are in January 2026, staring down the same road Britain took in the 1930s. The World Economic Forum. As experts aren't being dramatic when they call geo-economic confrontation. The number one risk, they're seeing the pieces move, escalating tariffs, tech sanctions, critical mineral controls, supply chain decoupling, and rival powers building their own economic fortresses. If this trend accelerates, most forecasts point to a bumpy 2026-2028 period. Global trade volumes could contract another 5 to 10% as retaliation spirals. Inflation stays sticky or climbs because imported goods cost more, adding pressure on households already stretched thin. Growth in advanced economies slows to around 1.5% or less, while emerging markets get hit hardest by dollar strength and commodity swings. The multipolar world without strong multilateral rules means more fragmentation. Think regional blocs competing instead of cooperating, just like the Imperial Preference system carved out a closed empire loop while the rest of the globe suffered. The warning signs are already flashing. tariff announcements ramping up, investment screening getting stricter, export bans on key technologies, and diplomatic language turning sharper by the week. Businesses are hedging, stockpiling, and rerouting supply chains ahead of time. Central banks are stuck. Rate cuts get harder if inflation reaccelerates from trade friction. The big difference from the 1930s is scale. The US dollar is the world's reserve, American consumption drives global demand, and the interconnected financial system means shocks spread faster than ever. If geoeconomic warfare turns into full-blown trade wars, we could see something worse than a mild downturn, a prolonged period of stagnation, higher inequality, and eroded trust in institutions. Britain's story shows the danger. Protectionism can feel like the only rational response when competition gets fierce, but it often accelerates decline by reducing innovation, raising costs, and isolating you from the bigger recovery. The good news? History isn't destiny. Britain could have chosen differently, pushed for multilateral deals, invested in competitiveness instead of walls. Today, policymakers have the same choice. Double down on confrontation or find ways to manage rivalries without breaking the system. But time is short. Davos starts in 2 days, and the tone there will tell us a lot. For regular people like us, the takeaway is simple. Pay attention, diversify what you can, gold, commodities, or assets that hold up in fragmented times, and don't assume the current rules will last forever. Empires fall slowly, and they usually don't see it coming until it's too late. Thanks for watching this rewind. If the parallels hit you the way they hit me, drop a comment. Do you think 2026 will be the turning point, or can we still steer away? Like if this woke you up, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe with notifications on. We'll keep rewinding the patterns that matter. Stay aware out there. The age of competition is here, and history is watching.